I'm not the runner I was 5 years ago, much less the runner I was 10 or 15 years ago. Looking back at, the reasons I used to run, or my training plans, or my general approach to running, it was immature and a little embarrassing and cringy when I look back on it. But when I look back on that young runner running the trails in my old road shoes because I didn't have trail shoes, and running in a cotton t-shirt or an old hoodie that I got in high school, or my $10 knockoff cheap running shorts that I'd been running in for the last 5 years. Looking back on that, I remember the raw infatuation that I had with the sport and the naivete and simplicity at which that I approached the sport and life in general. I was just immature. And I look back on that time with a little bit of embarrassment, a little bit of pity, and a little bit of nostalgia. I've talked before about how I've used running as a way to feel worthy. I've used running as a way to lose weight, as a coping mechanism, as a ritual, and as meditation. I've gone through phases where I've raced a lot, and then I've gone through phases where I've taken years off from racing. The change that I'm looking back on is not change that is conscious. It's change that is slow and methodical and oftentimes unconscious. That unconscious change has happened with my identity. I used to see myself as a cross-country runner, and then I was a marathoner, and then I was a trail runner, and then an ultra marathoner, and then back to marathoner. And I didn't even consciously make those identity changes. They just happened. But then I also saw myself as the runner who never quits. And then last year I had my first DNF. That was an instant collapse of an identity that I held close. Looking back on all of these identity changes and these different phases of my running and of life, I can clearly see the seasons and cycles of change. But in the moment, it was hard for me to not think that I had arrived at some sort of final state, that I had finally identified with my true self, or that I had finally found the perfect approach to life. And it makes me wonder, why do we feel the need to align ourselves with specific identities? Why do we need to identify ourselves or align ourselves with an identity? And why do we cling to the current versions of ourselves like we have finally found our true self, that we finally reached the final stage, knowing fully that looking back, we felt that way at each stage previous to the one we're in, and we changed. This is as true in running as it is in life. My wife and I were recently looking back at some pictures and video from our honeymoon 13 years ago. And I look back at the person that I was then with that same feeling of embarrassment, and I can see the immaturity and the naivete and the ignorance that I had. And I lamented to my wife while we were looking at these pictures and videos, I said, I wish you would have married the man I am today rather than the person I was back then, because you deserved so much more. And I get that same feeling when I look at pictures of my son, my oldest, when he was younger, and I think how much he deserved the dad I am today rather than the dad I was back then. And it's mixed with the feeling and the knowledge that it took me loving my wife in order for me to learn how to be a better husband. And it took me loving my son in order to learn how to be a better dad. And so in those moments, I sit in this paradoxical feeling where I feel both pity and a little bit of embarrassment for that person, but I also celebrate the person I was, because I know that I was on the path to becoming who I am today. And so it makes me wonder, Does growth always carry with it the guilt of who you used to be? And so, like many other people that came before me, much wiser than I am, I have also come to the conclusion that the only thing constant in this life is change. But the change that I'm talking about is not the change that you set goals for, that you consciously make decisions to try and accomplish this change. The change I'm talking about today is gradual, it's inevitable and unconscious. It's like erosion. It's silent and gradual and undeniable. And as I've said multiple times, I think one of the biggest, most important purposes that we have in this life as humans is to wake up, is to make the unconscious conscious, to move from the passenger seat into the driver's seat. And so in this context, I want to wake up so that we end up where we want to be down the road, instead of looking in the mirror only to see the reflection of a person that we don't even recognize. In Hinduism and Buddhism, there's this concept called samsara. At least I think I'm saying that right. Samsara is this cycle of birth and death and rebirth. In samsara, if you're stuck in a samsara, you are trapped in an eternal illusion where you mistake the temporary for the eternal. You mistake the ego for the self, and you mistake comfort for true peace. The goal in both of these traditions is liberation from samsara. In Hinduism, it's called moksha. In Buddhism, it's called nirvana. I'm sure you've heard of nirvana. But like I said, the goal is liberation from the illusion that the self is something to be preserved. Each time you cling to an old version of yourself, or you resist aging, or you seek validation or fear slowing down, you're caught in a samsara. Nirvana and moksha is the goal, and it's not to reject this cycle. It's to reveal its illusion. Liberation teaches us to stop clinging and to start witnessing. In Taoism, it is understood that we are more like a river than we are a rock, that we are eternally flowing and changing. And to cling to identity is like damming the Tao, or stopping the flow of life. This leads to stagnation, and in Taoism we're taught that it's better to flow with the Tao, to go with the flow and become its conscious passenger rather than to fight the inevitable current. To me, it's very similar to what the Stoics say, that we need to understand what we can control and what we can't control, and to amor fati, which is to love what is, to love what we can't control. This isn't far off from Christian thought either. The idea of death and rebirth is closely tied to the idea of repentance and baptism in Christianity. There's a Greek word that is metanoia, and it is often the word that is translated to repentance in the New Testament. And metanoia is a change in perspective on the world and yourself. And this profound shift turns you not necessarily just from sin, but also from illusion. It can come fast or slow. When it's fast, it is obvious because it's shocking. But it usually doesn't come all at once. It usually comes in a slow turn. And before you realize it, your entire worldview has shifted. From my perspective, one of the central themes in Christian theology is this idea of letting old ideas and identities die to bring in new ones in this cycle of death and rebirth and life. In all of these traditions, it is acknowledged that we go through cycles and seasons in life, but the goal of these traditions is to help us wake up to these cycles and make them into spirals of shedding and becoming over and over, moving forward instead of just in a circle. Liberation from samsara isn't about quitting the game. It's about waking up inside it. Metanoia is not about shame or guilt or penance. It is about the moment of realization when you realize that the story you've been telling yourself is just a chapter. It's not the whole book. Or that the story you've been telling yourself isn't true, and maybe it never was. The problem isn't the death of the old self. It's the fact that we might not even realize that the old self has died, and yet we drag the corpse forward. I reserve the right to change. I used to be a runner that never quit races. I'm not that runner anymore. I used to be that young father and young husband. I'm not those people anymore either. I still run, I still train, I live and learn. Each cycle in life, each season of life adds to the experience of life itself. And maybe if we can wake up inside the samsara, wake up inside these cycles, maybe we can orient ourselves towards wisdom. If we can let go, if we can flow with the Tao, if we can wake up, we can make our circles into spirals as we move forward with the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. I don't know. Once again, I am not an expert in any of this. This is an exploration in me thinking out loud, but I hope this was interesting or thought-provoking. And if it was, I hope you'll stick around, and I'll catch you in the next video.